The courthouse steps echoed with the judge's final words, each syllable falling like a hammer blow against Marcus Sullivan's chest. 23 years old, heir to the Sullivan shipping fortune, and now bound by law to marry a woman he'd never seen. The crime that brought him here seemed almost laughable now, a drunken brawl that left a merchant's son with a broken nose and his family's reputation in tatters. But in 1847 Boston, honor debts ran deeper than blood, and Judge Harrison Blackwood had found the perfect punishment for a young man who thought his wealth could buy him out of any consequence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. You will wed Eleanor Hartwell within the fortnight, the judge had declared, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the packed courtroom. The girl bears the scars of the fire that took her family's mill 3 winters past, perhaps living with the consequences of someone else's misfortune will teach you the weight of your own actions. Marcus had heard the whispers about Eleanor Hartwell. The mill fire had been the talk of Boston society for months, how the flames had consumed not only the Hartwell family's livelihood, but had left their youngest daughter permanently marked. Some said half her face melted beyond recognition. Others claimed her hands were so damaged she couldn't hold a teacup without dropping it. The stories grew more grotesque with each telling, as stories often do when told by people who have never looked suffering in the eye. Standing now in the shadow of his father's mansion on Beacon Hill, Marcus felt the weight of his father's disappointment pressing down on him like a physical force. Cornelius Sullivan had built their shipping empire from nothing, clawing his way up from the docks to the drawing rooms of Boston's elite. Every scar on his weathered hands told a story of sacrifice, every gray hair earned through years of 18-hour days and sleepless nights spent calculating cargo weights and profit margins. 23 years I've spent building this name, his father said, not looking up from the ledgers spread across his mahogany desk. 23 years of proving that the Sullivans belong among Boston's finest families. And you've undone it. All in one night of drunken stupidity. The study smelled of leather and tobacco, familiar scents that had once brought Marcus comfort. Now they seemed to mock him, reminders of a privileged life he'd taken for granted. The walls were lined with portraits of Sullivan ships, the Mersey's Dawn, the Atlantic Promise, the Boston Belle, each one representing years of his father's sweat and determination. Maps covered one entire wall, marked with trade routes that stretched from Boston Harbor to ports in Liverpool, Hamburg, and beyond. The Blackwood family controls half the shipping contracts in this city, his father continued, finally looking up with eyes that held no warmth. Judge Blackwood's word is law in matters of commerce. Cross him, and we lose everything. The warehouses, the ships, the men who depend on us for their livelihoods, all of it gone because my son couldn't keep his fists to himself. Marcus had never seen his father look so old. The man who had once seemed as indestructible as the iron-hulled ships in their fleet now appeared fragile, his shoulders bent under the weight of potential ruin. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. This wasn't just about his own fate anymore. Dozens of families depended on Sullivan shipping for their survival. The dock workers who loaded their cargo, the ship captains who navigated their vessels across treacherous waters, the clerks who managed their accounts, all of them would suffer if the Blackwood family decided to destroy them. "Tell me about her," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. His father's laugh was bitter, devoid of any humor. "Eleanor Hartwell? What's to tell? She's 20 years old, barely educated beyond basic letters and numbers. Her father owned a small textile mill before the fire took everything. Now she lives with her aunt in a boarding house near the harbor, taking in sewing to earn her keep. The fire." He paused, running a hand through his graying hair. "The reports say she was trapped in the mill office when the flames spread. They found her 3 hours later, unconscious from the smoke. The burns covered her left side face, neck, arm, hand. She survived, But survival comes in many forms. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Marcus tried to imagine what she must look like, this woman who would become his wife in less than 2 weeks. But every image his mind conjured seemed inadequate, based as they were on the cruel whispers of society gossips who had likely never seen her face to face. Judge Blackwood arranged this marriage deliberately. His father continued, "He knows our family's reputation depends on appearances, on being seen as respectable and refined. Marrying you to a scarred woman from a working family, it's designed to humiliate us, to remind everyone that we're still just one generation removed from the docks." The cruelty of it was breathtaking in its precision. Judge Blackwood hadn't simply demanded payment or imposed a fine. He had crafted a punishment that would serve as a constant reminder of Marcus's failings, a living symbol of his poor judgment that would follow him for the rest of his life. Every social gathering, every business meeting, every public appearance would be shadowed by the presence of a wife society deemed damaged and inappropriate. Marcus walked to the window overlooking Boston Harbor, watching the forest of masts sway in the evening breeze. Somewhere out there, in a boarding house near these very docks, Eleanor Hartwell was probably sewing by lamplight, unaware that her life was about to change as dramatically as his own. Did she know about the marriage arrangement? Had anyone bothered to ask her opinion, or was she simply another piece moved around on Judge Blackwood's chessboard? The thought struck him as particularly cruel, that she might be as trapped in this situation as he was, perhaps more so. At least he had grown up with privilege and education. He had options, connections, the safety net of his family's wealth. Even if their reputation suffered, what did she have? A reputation ruined by circumstances beyond her control, physical scars that marked her as different in a society that prized beauty above all else, and now a forced marriage to a man who resented her very existence. His father's voice broke through his brooding. "The wedding will be small, private. We'll hold it at St. Michael's Church, early morning, with only immediate family in attendance. The less attention we draw, the better. After that ... He shrugged, the gesture conveying years of weariness. "After that, you'll figure out how to live with the choices you've made." The next few days passed in a blur of reluctant preparations. His mother, Catherine Sullivan, threw herself into the arrangements with the same determined efficiency she brought to managing their household. But Marcus could see the strain in the tight lines around her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking. She had married into Boston society, worked tirelessly to establish their family's place among the city's elite. This forced marriage felt like a repudiation of everything she had accomplished. "Perhaps it won't be as bad as we fear," she said. One evening as they reviewed the guest list, a pathetically short document that included only his parents, his younger sister Margaret, and Eleanor's aunt. The girl might be ... pleasant, intelligent. Sometimes adversity creates the strongest character. But her voice lacked conviction, the words falling flat in the opulent drawing room where they sat. The room itself seemed to mock their situation imported. Silk wallpaper, crystal chandeliers, furniture crafted by master artisans in Philadelphia and New York. All of it represented the life Marcus was expected to maintain while married to a woman society had already written off as damaged goods. Margaret, 19 and possessed of the kind of natural beauty that opened doors throughout Boston society, tried her best to remain optimistic. "Maybe she's not as badly scarred as people say," she offered. "You know how gossip grows in the telling. By the time a story passes through 5 drawing rooms, a small cut becomes a mortal wound." But even Margaret's usual cheerfulness seemed forced. She was supposed to make her debut into society next spring, and having a sister-in-law who bore visible scars would complicate her own prospects considerably. The cruel mathematics of social standing meant that one family member's misfortune affected them all. As the wedding day approached, Marcus found himself walking the streets of Boston at odd hours, trying to process what his life was about to become. He passed the boarding house where Eleanor lived several times, a narrow 3-story building squeezed between a rope maker's shop and a tavern that catered to merchant sailors. The windows were dark except for a single room on the second floor, where a faint yellow glow suggested someone working by lamplight long into the night. Was that her window? Was she sitting there even now, sewing by candlelight to earn the few coins that kept her fed and housed? The thought made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite define. His own problems seemed almost trivial compared to the daily struggle for survival that her life must represent. He tried to imagine their first meeting, their wedding day, the awkward weeks that would follow as they attempted to build some kind of life together. Would she resent him as much as he resented the situation? Would she be grateful for the security his name provided? Or would she see through to the selfish motives that had landed them both in this predicament? The more he thought about it, the more the weight of his responsibility pressed down on him. This wasn't just about his own comfort or reputation anymore. In 6 days, he would be responsible for another human being's happiness and well-being. A woman who had already suffered more than most people endure in a lifetime would be depending on him to provide not just material security, but basic human decency and respect. The irony wasn't lost on him that Judge Blackwood's punishment might actually serve its intended purpose. For the first time in his privileged life, Marcus was being forced to consider the consequences of his actions, not just for himself, but for someone else entirely. Someone vulnerable, someone who had no choice in the matter, someone who deserved better than to be treated as the price of his redemption. Standing in the shadow of his family's mansion, looking out over the harbor where his father's ships bobbed at anchor, Marcus realized that everything he had taken for granted was about to change. The comfortable certainty of his future, the assumption that his wealth and name would smooth every path, the luxury of making decisions based solely on his own desires, all of it was ending. In 6 days, he would stand before God and promise to honor and protect a woman he had never met, a woman whose scars would serve as a daily reminder of his own failures. The punishment was elegant in its completeness, designed to teach him lessons that no amount of money or privilege could buy. But as he watched the sunset over Boston Harbor, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Marcus found himself wondering about something else entirely. Beyond the political maneuvering and social consequences, beyond the shame and resentment and fear, there was a woman named Eleanor Hartwell who was about to have her life turned upside down just as completely as his own. What was she thinking about as she sat in that lamp-lit room? Was she afraid, angry, resigned? Did she have dreams and hopes that this marriage would destroy? Or had life already taken those from her? The questions multiplied in his mind, each one a reminder that he was about to become intimately connected to a complete stranger's fate. Tomorrow he would meet her for the first time. Tomorrow he would look into the face that had become the subject of so much cruel speculation and see the reality behind the rumors. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tomorrow he would begin to understand the true cost of the choices that had brought them both to this moment. The harbor bells chimed 8 o'clock, their bronze voices carrying across the water like a funeral dirge. Somewhere in the boarding house by the docks, Eleanor Hartwell was probably blowing out her lamp and preparing for sleep, unaware that a young man on Beacon Hill was standing at his window, wondering if either of them would survive what was coming with their humanity intact. The morning of their first meeting arrived gray and bitter, with November wind cutting through Boston streets like a surgeon's blade. Marcus stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his collar for the 3rd time, hands steadier than he expected, but mind racing with questions that had no comfortable answers. His reflection stared back, tall, dark-haired, bearing the kind of aristocratic features that had opened doors throughout his 23 years. Today, those same features felt like a mockery, a reminder of privileges that had led him to this moment. Downstairs, the breakfast table sat largely untouched. His mother had arranged fresh flowers in the center white roses that seemed inappropriately bridal for what was essentially a business meeting. His father read shipping reports with unusual intensity, as if the cargo manifest could somehow transport him away from the morning's obligations. Margaret picked at her toast, glancing up, occasionally with sympathy that Marcus found harder to bear than anger would have been. "The carriage is ready," his father announced without looking up from his papers. "Reverend Morrison will meet us at the boarding house at 10 o'clock sharp. The ceremony is scheduled for 11. The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a dying fire. No one mentioned that this was supposed to be the happiest day of a young man's life. No one spoke of love or joy or the future they were building together. Instead, they moved through the motions with the grim efficiency of people attending a funeral. The ride through Boston streets gave Marcus his first real glimpse of the world Eleanor inhabited. As their elegant carriage rolled away from Beacon Hill's manicured gardens and gas-lit mansions, the city transformed around them. The broad avenues lined with elm trees gave way to narrow cobblestone lanes crowded with merchants, carts and working people hurrying about their daily business. The smell changed too, from the refined scents of imported flowers and quality leather to the earthier aromas of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present tang of salt air from the harbor. Mrs. Abigail Fletcher's boarding house occupied a corner lot where two busy streets converged, creating a constant stream of foot traffic that kicked up dust and debris. The building itself was respectable enough, 3 stories of weathered brick with clean windows and a freshly painted front door, but it existed in a different universe from the Sullivan mansion. Here, respectability was earned through hard work and careful spending, not inherited through generations of accumulated wealth. Reverend Morrison waited on the front steps, a thin man with prematurely gray hair who had performed more marriages of convenience than love in his 30 years of ministry. He greeted Marcus with professional courtesy tinged with obvious discomfort. Even men of God, it seemed, found it difficult to celebrate unions born from legal obligation rather than mutual affection. "The young lady is waiting upstairs, Reverend," Morrison said, his voice carefully neutral. "Mrs. Fletcher has prepared her parlor for the ceremony. It's single quotes s. intimate." Intimate. Marcus nearly laughed at the euphemism. Small, more likely, cramped, a far cry from the grand church wedding his parents had always envisioned for their son's matrimonial debut into society. The boarding house interior surprised him with its cleanliness and attention to detail. The hallways were narrow but well-maintained, with freshly waxed floors and walls decorated with modest but tasteful prints of Boston Harbor and the surrounding countryside. Mrs. Fletcher herself appeared at the foot of the stairs, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the kind of practical beauty that comes from years of managing other people's problems with grace and efficiency. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, extending a work-roughed hand, "I'm honored to have you in my home, though I confess the circumstances are unusual." Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct. Marcus found himself liking her immediately, which somehow made everything more complicated. If Eleanor's guardian was this impressive, what did that say about Eleanor herself? The cruel gossip that had shaped his expectations suddenly seemed less reliable than he'd assumed. "Eleanor is in the back parlor," Mrs. Fletcher continued, leading them down a hallway lined with doors to individual rooms. "She's been preparing since dawn. I should warn you, she's nervous. This whole arrangement has been difficult for her to accept. Difficult." Another careful word choice that probably concealed volumes of genuine suffering. Marcus felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over him as he realized how completely he had focused on his own predicament while barely considering hers. She hadn't chosen to marry a stranger any more than he had. The difference was that society would judge her far more harshly if the marriage failed. They paused outside a door marked with brass numbers. 7. Mrs. Fletcher knocked gently. "Eleanor, dear. Mr. Sullivan and Reverend Morrison are here." The voice that answered was soft but clear. "Yes, Aunt Abigail. I'm ready." Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs as Mrs. Fletcher turned the handle and pushed open the door. The room beyond was small but filled with morning light from 2 large windows that faced the harbor. Simple furniture, a horsehair sofa, 2 matching chairs, a writing desk against one wall, created an atmosphere of modest comfort. Fresh flowers sat in a chipped ceramic vase, their bright colors a cheerful contrast to the gray November morning. And there, standing with her back to the door, looking out at the harbor through one of the windows, was Eleanor Hartwell. Marcus's first impression was of stillness. Not the frozen stillness of fear, but something deeper, a quality of composed waiting that suggested inner strength rather than resignation. She wore a dress of deep blue wool, simply cut but well fitted, with long sleeves that covered her arms completely. Her hair, a rich chestnut brown, was arranged in a neat chignon at the base of her neck. From behind, she looked like any other young woman preparing for her wedding day. Then she turned around. The left side of her face told the story of the mill fire and raised, reddened skin that stretched from her temple to her jaw. The scars were extensive but not grotesque, more like a map of suffering written in flesh that had healed but never forgotten. Her left eye was slightly smaller than her right, giving her face an asymmetrical quality that was startling at first glance, but somehow became less noticeable as he continued to look at her. But it was her right side that truly surprised him. Untouched by flame, it revealed classical features of genuine beauty: high cheekbones, a straight nose, lips that were full and well-formed. Her right eye was a remarkable shade of green, like deep water in sunlight, and it regarded him with intelligence and barely concealed apprehension. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious tension in her posture. "I'm Eleanor Hartwell." She didn't extend her hand, and Marcus suddenly understood why. Her left hand, he noticed, was partially concealed by her sleeve, and what he could see of it showed the same pattern of scarring that marked her face. The fire had taken its toll on that entire side of her body, leaving her marked in ways that would never fully heal. "Miss Hartwell," he managed, his voice rougher than intended. "I'm pleased to meet you." The inadequacy of conventional pleasantries in their situation struck them both simultaneously. Here they were, 2 strangers about to pledge their lives to each other, exchanging formalities as if this were a normal social introduction. The absurdity of it might have been funny under different circumstances. Reverend Morrison cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should proceed with the ceremony. I have another appointment at noon." Even the minister, it seemed, was eager to complete this uncomfortable business and move on to more pleasant duties. Marcus couldn't blame him. There was something profoundly sad about a wedding where no one smiled, where the bride and groom regarded each other like opponents trying to assess potential threats. The ceremony itself was mercifully brief. They stood side by side before the window overlooking the harbor, with Mrs. Fletcher serving as witness and Marcus's family arranged uncomfortably in the small parlor's remaining space. Reverend Morrison spoke the traditional words, but they sounded hollow in the cramped room, stripped of their usual power to inspire and uplift. When it came time for the vows, Eleanor's voice never wavered. She spoke each word clearly, meeting Marcus's eyes with a directness that surprised him. Whatever else she might be, she wasn't a coward. She was facing this unwanted future with a courage that put his own reluctant acceptance to shame. Marcus found himself studying her profile as she spoke. The contrast between her damaged and undamaged sides was striking, but he was beginning to see past the surface to something more complex. The way she held herself, the careful modulation of her voice, the intelligence evident in her green eyes, all of it suggested Depths that the cruel gossips of Boston society had never bothered to discover. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Morrison announced. And for the first time that morning, genuine awkwardness settled over the room. Marcus turned toward Eleanor, uncertain how to proceed. The scars on the left side of her face made the traditional kiss seem fraught with potential for causing offense or discomfort. But she solved the dilemma by simply tilting her head slightly to the right, offering her unmarked cheek. The gesture was practical rather than romantic, but it showed a consideration for his comfort that he hadn't expected. The kiss was brief, formal, and told them nothing about each other except that they were both capable of getting through difficult moments with dignity intact. "Congratulations," Reverend Morrison said, though his tone suggested he was congratulating them on surviving an ordeal rather than beginning a new life together. "May God bless your union." The small gathering began to break up with the same efficiency that had marked the entire proceedings. Marcus's parents offered polite congratulations to Eleanor, their trained social graces covering whatever private thoughts they harbored about their new daughter-in-law. Margaret, bless her heart, actually managed a genuine smile and a warm embrace that seemed to surprise Eleanor with its sincerity. "Welcome to the family," Margaret whispered, and for just a moment, Eleanor's careful composure wavered, revealing something vulnerable beneath the surface. Mrs. Fletcher had prepared a modest wedding breakfast in her dining room, fresh bread, eggs, bacon, and coffee that was stronger and more flavorful than anything served in the Sullivan mansion. The conversation was stilted, filled with the kind of forced politeness that makes everyone uncomfortable, but at least it was conversation. Eleanor answered questions about her interests and background with the same careful honesty she had brought to the wedding vows. She had been educated at a small school for working-class girls. She explained, learning basic arithmetic, reading, and writing along with practical skills like sewing and household management. Before the fire, she had helped her father with the mill's bookkeeping, discovering an aptitude for numbers that had surprised everyone, including herself. "I was hoping to become a teacher," she said quietly when Margaret asked about her plans. "Before the marriage. There's a growing movement to educate working-class children, especially girls. I thought I might be useful in such work." The past tense hung heavy in the air. Whatever dreams she had harbored for independence and meaningful work had died along with her family in that mill fire. Now she was Mrs. Marcus Sullivan, bound by law and custom to a life she had never chosen with a man she didn't know. As the morning wore on, Marcus found himself paying closer attention to small details. The way Eleanor carefully positioned herself so that her scarred side was less visible to the group. How she used her right hand for everything, keeping her damaged left hand mostly hidden in the folds of her skirt. The slight flinch when his father mentioned the warehouse district, where her family's mill had stood, but he also noticed her intelligence, the thoughtful questions she asked about the shipping business, the quick way she grasped the economics of international trade when his father described their routes to European ports. She might be scarred and socially disadvantaged, but she was far from stupid. The time came to leave for what would be their new home, a small house his father owned in the middle-class district between Beacon Hill and the harbor. It wasn't a mansion, but it was respectable, with 2 bedrooms, a sitting room, kitchen, and small garden. More importantly, it was far enough from the family mansion to provide privacy while close enough for propriety. Eleanor packed her belongings in a single worn leather satchel, everything she owned in the world fitting into a space smaller than Marcus's shaving kit. The sight of it struck him forcefully with the reality of their different circumstances, where he was temporarily inconvenienced by an unwanted marriage. She was completely dependent on his goodwill for basic survival. The ride to their new home passed in silence. Eleanor sat pressed against the far side of the carriage, her scarred side turned toward the window so he couldn't see it. Her profile, unmarked and lovely, reminded him again of how cruel fate had been to damage something so naturally beautiful. But more than that, her obvious effort to spare him discomfort touched something in his chest that he wasn't quite ready to examine closely. The house stood on Chestnut Street, a narrow 3-story building with a red brick facade and black shutters. It was smaller than anything Marcus had ever lived in, but Eleanor's reaction told him it was grander than anything she had dared hope for. Her green eyes widened as she took in the well-maintained exterior, the small front garden with its wrought iron fence, the brass nameplate beside the front door. "It's beautiful," she said softly, and he realized it was the first spontaneous comment she had made all day. Inside, the house was furnished in a simple but comfortable style. His mother had seen to the details: fresh linens, stocked pantry, flowers in the front parlor, creating the appearance of a home, even if it didn't yet feel like one. Eleanor moved through the rooms with the careful attention of someone memorizing a dream, touching surfaces lightly as if to confirm they were real. The master bedroom presented their first real awkwardness. One large bed dominated the space, its implications impossible to ignore. They were married now, legally bound, and certain expectations came with that status regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. Eleanor stopped in the doorway, her fingers gripping the frame tightly enough that her knuckles showed white beneath the skin. Marcus found himself looking anywhere but at the bed or at her face, suddenly aware of how little thought he had given to the practical realities of sharing living space with a stranger. "I can sleep in the spare room," he said quickly, until we're more comfortable with each other." Relief flooded her features so obviously that he felt a stab of something that might have been hurt if he hadn't recognized it as perfectly reasonable. Of course she would be afraid of physical intimacy with a man she had just met. Of course she would need time to adjust to the reality of marriage before facing its more intimate requirements. "Thank you," she said simply, and he understood that those 2 words carried the weight of gratitude for more than just sleeping arrangements. He was offering her time, space, the luxury of gradual adjustment to a situation neither of them had chosen. The rest of their first day together passed in careful politeness. Eleanor explored the house more thoroughly, familiarizing herself with the kitchen and pantry, testing the water pump, examining the coal stove with the expertise of someone who understood the practical details of running a household. Marcus attempted to work in the small study his father had equipped with a desk and business papers, but found himself listening to her footsteps overhead, wondering what she was thinking as she adjusted to her new circumstances. Dinner was an awkward affair. Eleanor cooked a simple meal of roasted chicken, potatoes, and vegetables, serving him at the small dining table before taking her own seat at the far end. The food was excellent, seasoned with herbs he didn't recognize, but the conversation was minimal. They were like 2 actors who had been thrust onto a stage without a script, improvising their way through scenes they had never rehearsed. As evening approached and the time came to retire, their mutual discomfort reached its peak. They stood in the upstairs hallway, each acutely aware of the bedroom doors on either side, the artificial nature of their living arrangement hanging between them like a wall. "Good night, Mrs. Sullivan," Marcus said formally. "Good night, Mr. Sullivan," she replied with equal formality, and then they retreated to their separate rooms, closing doors between them that felt more symbolic than practical. Marcus lay awake in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling around them, wondering what his new wife was thinking in the room across the hall. Was she as confused and uncertain as he was? Did she regret the circumstances that had brought them together, or was she simply grateful for the security his name provided? The questions multiplied in his mind as the hours passed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, learning to live together, establishing routines, figuring out how to build some kind of life from the fragments of their forced union. But tonight, in the darkness of their separate rooms, they were still strangers, bound by law but not by understanding, sharing a house but not yet sharing anything that mattered. The harsh new reality of their marriage had begun. 3 weeks into their marriage, Marcus discovered that Eleanor rose before dawn every morning to tend the small garden behind their house. He made this discovery quite by accident, waking early due to a persistent cough that had plagued him since the November cold snap began. From his bedroom window, he caught sight of movement in the gray pre-dawn light, a figure in a dark wool cloak kneeling among what he had assumed were dead flower beds. She worked with methodical precision, her movements economical and purposeful. Even in the dim light, he could see that she favored her right hand, using her left only when absolutely necessary. She was preparing the soil for winter, he realized, cutting back the last of the season's growth and covering tender plants with burlap and straw. It was careful, knowledgeable work that spoke of experience he hadn't known she possessed. The sight stirred something unexpected in his chest. Here was his wife, a woman he barely knew despite sharing a house with her for 3 weeks, quietly tending to beauty in a world that had shown her little kindness. She asked nothing of him, expected nothing beyond basic civility, and yet she was creating something lovely from this small patch of earth. Behind their home, their daily routine had settled into a pattern of polite distance. Eleanor managed the household with quiet efficiency, keeping the rooms clean and warm, preparing meals that were simple but flavorful, mending clothes and linens with the skill of someone who had learned to make things last. Marcus spent his days at the Sullivan shipping offices, learning the business his father would eventually pass to him, returning home each evening to find dinner waiting and his wife reading by the parlor fire. They exchanged pleasantries about the weather, the neighborhood, occasionally about his work or her household tasks. But these conversations rarely ventured beyond surface politeness. She seemed determined to maintain the emotional distance between them, and he had been content to let her. It was easier, after all, to treat their marriage as a business arrangement, rather than attempt the messy work of actually getting to know each other. But something about seeing her in the garden, working alone in the dawn light, made him reconsider that approach. Perhaps the distance between them wasn't entirely her choice. Perhaps she was simply protecting herself from a husband who had shown little interest in her as a person, beyond his legal obligation to provide for her basic needs. The realization was uncomfortable because it was accurate. He had been so focused on his own resentment about their forced marriage that he had treated Eleanor more like a household fixture than a human being with thoughts, feelings, and desires of her own. She cooked his meals, cleaned his house, and asked nothing in return, except to be left alone with her books and her sewing. It was a lonely existence for both of them, but especially for her. That evening, as they sat in the parlor after dinner, he with shipping ledgers, she with needlework, Marcus found himself watching her more carefully than usual. The firelight flickered across her face, and he noticed how she automatically positioned herself so that her scarred side was turned away from him. It was such a habitual gesture that she probably wasn't even aware of it anymore, but it spoke volumes about her self-consciousness and her assumption that her appearance caused him discomfort. "The garden behind the house," he said suddenly, breaking the evening silence. "I saw you working on it this morning." Her needle paused in its stitching. "I hope you don't mind," she said carefully. "I know I should have asked permission first. I can stop if you prefer." "No," he interrupted, surprised by how quickly she had moved to apologize. "I was curious about it. I didn't know you were interested in gardening." She looked up at him then, and he caught a glimpse of something guarded in her expression. "There was a garden at the mill," she said quietly. "My mother taught me before. She died. Plants they don't care what you look like. They respond to care and attention, nothing more." The simple statement carried depths of meaning that made his chest tighten. How many people had made her feel that her appearance mattered more than her character? How many times had she been judged by her scars rather than her actions? "What did you plant?" he asked, genuinely curious now. Surprise flickered across her features, as if the question was unexpected. mostly herbs and vegetables for next spring. Some flowers that should survive the winter. It's not much, but it gives me something to do with my hands. I'd like to see it sometime, he said. If you wouldn't mind showing me. She stared at him for a long moment, clearly trying to determine if he was being polite or sincere. Of course, she said finally, though there's not much to see this time of year. The conversation lapsed back into comfortable silence, but something had shifted between them. A door had opened, just a crack, allowing the possibility of genuine interaction rather than mere coexistence. Marcus found himself paying closer attention to the small details of their shared life, noticing things that had escaped his attention during the first weeks of their marriage. Eleanor read voraciously, borrowing books from a lending library near the harbor whenever she went to market. Her choices were eclectic novels by Charles Dickens and Jane Austen, volumes of poetry, treatises on household management, even technical books about agriculture and animal husbandry. She absorbed information with the hunger of someone who had been denied formal education, but possessed a naturally inquisitive mind. She was also an exceptional seamstress, capable of taking apart worn garments and reconstructing them into something entirely new. He discovered this when he returned from work one evening to find her surrounded by fabric and pattern pieces, transforming one of his mother's old dresses into something more suitable for her own figure and lifestyle. "Mrs. Fletcher gave me this," she explained, holding up the deep green silk that had once belonged to Catherine Sullivan. "She said your mother thought I might be able to make use of it." The dress had been expensive when new, made from fabric imported from France and cut in the latest fashion. But it had been designed for a woman of his mother's height and build, which differed considerably from Eleanor's more delicate frame. Rather than simply alter the existing garment, Eleanor was completely reconstructing it, using every scrap of the valuable fabric to create something entirely new. "That seems like a lot of work," Marcus observed, settling into his chair with the evening newspaper. "I enjoy it," she said simply. "It's like solving a puzzle. How to make the best use of what you have. How to create something beautiful from pieces that don't quite fit together." Her words resonated in ways she probably hadn't intended. Wasn't that exactly what they were trying to do with their marriage? Create something workable from pieces that didn't naturally fit together? As December arrived with its first serious snowfall, Marcus began to notice other things about his wife. She left food scraps for the stray cats that prowled their neighborhood. But she did it discreetly, as if embarrassed by the kindness. She never complained about the cold, even though their small house was drafty and coal was expensive enough that they kept the fires banked low during the day. She wrote letters every Sunday to Mrs. Fletcher, keeping her former guardian informed about her new life with the careful detail of someone who understood the older woman's genuine concern. Most intriguingly, she had begun leaving small gifts around the house. Nothing dramatic or expensive, just thoughtful touches that made their living space more comfortable. A pillow she had sewn for his favorite chair, using fabric left over from the dress reconstruction. A bookmark crafted from ribbon and cardboard, appearing on his desk beside the shipping reports he studied each evening. A jar of jam made from the last of the autumn apples, flavored with spices he couldn't identify but found delicious. She never mentioned these gifts directly, never sought credit or thanks for them. They simply appeared, like small acts of grace in a marriage that had begun with such ungracious circumstances. Marcus found himself looking forward to discovering them, wondering what small kindness he would find next. The bookmark proved to be particularly useful. His work required reading numerous documents, cargo manifests, shipping schedules, letters from port agents in distant cities. The bookmark was perfectly sized for the leather-bound ledgers he carried between home and office, and it bore a small embroidered design that reminded him of her skilled needlework. Using it daily, he found himself thinking about the hands that had created it, the time and care that had gone into such a simple but useful gift. It occurred to him that he had done nothing similar for her. Their marriage might be a legal arrangement, rather than a love match, but that didn't excuse his failure to show basic consideration for her comfort and happiness. She was making efforts to improve their shared life. The least he could do was reciprocate. The opportunity presented itself when he discovered her reading by inadequate lamplight one evening, squinting at the pages in a way that suggested the strain was giving her a headache. The parlor's single oil lamp provided enough light for basic activities, but fine work like reading or sewing required better illumination. "That can't be good for your eyes," he said, looking up from his own papers. She immediately closed the book and set it aside. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize the light was bothering you." "It's not bothering me," he said quickly. "I was concerned about you. That lamp isn't bright enough for reading." She looked confused by his concern. "It's fine," she said automatically. "I'm used to making do with less." The phrase hit him like a physical blow. Used to making do with less. Of course she was. Her entire life had been about making do with less money, less opportunity, less consideration from a world that judged her by her scars rather than her character. And now she was married to a man who had provided her with shelter and food but had never thought to consider her comfort beyond basic survival needs. The next day, Marcus visited the finest lamp shop in Boston, explaining his requirements to the proprietor with more care than he had ever devoted to a purchase for himself. He wanted something that would provide excellent light for reading and needlework, but that would also be beautiful enough to enhance their modest parlor. Price was no object. This was the first real gift he would give his wife, and it needed to convey the respect and consideration he had failed to show her during their first month of marriage. The lamp he selected was elegant in its simplicity, polished brass with a crystal chimney and a mechanism that allowed for precise control of the flame height. It was expensive enough to represent a significant investment, but not so ornate as to seem inappropriate for their middle-class home. Most importantly, it would provide the quality of light Eleanor needed for her reading and sewing. Bringing it home required careful planning. He wanted to surprise her, but he also wanted to present it properly, not simply leave it to be discovered like her small anonymous gifts to him. The opportunity came when she mentioned needing to visit the market for supplies to preserve the last vegetables from her garden. While she was out, Marcus set up the new lamp in the parlor, positioning it beside her favorite chair where it would provide optimal light for her evening activities. He adjusted the flame carefully, making sure it cast a warm, steady glow that eliminated the shadows that had previously made reading difficult. Then he waited, with an anticipation that surprised him with its intensity. Eleanor returned just as dusk was settling over their street, carrying her market basket and stamping snow from her boots in the small entryway. She moved through her usual routine, hanging up her cloak, putting away the food she had purchased, checking the fire in the kitchen stove. When she finally entered the parlor, she stopped abruptly in the doorway. The new lamp transformed the room, where before the space had been dimly lit and slightly gloomy in the evening hours. Now it glowed with warm, welcoming light that made the modest furniture and simple decorations seem more elegant and inviting. "What ... she began, then stopped, her eyes fixed on the lamp with an expression he couldn't quite read. "For your reading," Marcus said, suddenly uncertain about his choice. "I noticed the old lamp wasn't bright enough. I thought this might be better." She approached the lamp slowly, her right hand reaching out to touch the polished brass base, as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "but you shouldn't have. It must have been terribly expensive." "You're my wife," he said simply. "You deserve to be comfortable in your own home." She looked at him then, really looked at him, with an expression that was complex and searching. For a moment, he thought she might cry, but instead she simply sighed, "Thank you. This is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me." The words were quietly spoken, but they carried a weight that made him realize how little genuine kindness she had experienced in her life. A simple lamp, something he could afford without any financial strain, represented luxury beyond her previous experience. The thought was both humbling and infuriating. How had the world failed her so completely that basic consideration felt like extraordinary generosity? That evening, she settled into her chair with a book and the new lamp, adjusting the flame until the light was perfect for reading. But instead of immediately opening her book, she looked across the room to where he sat with his own papers. "Would you like me to read aloud?" she asked. "The book is quite interesting. It's about botanical discoveries in the American territories. Some of the plants they found might grow well in our climate." It was the first time she had suggested a shared activity, the first indication that she might welcome his company rather than simply tolerate his presence. "I'd like that very much," he said, setting aside his shipping reports. Her voice, when she began to read, was clear and pleasant, with a natural rhythm that made even technical botanical descriptions engaging. She read intelligently, pausing to explain unfamiliar terms or to comment on passages that particularly interested her. It became clear that she understood the subject matter thoroughly, that her interest in gardening extended far beyond simple hobby to genuine scholarly curiosity about plant life and cultivation techniques. As she read, Marcus found himself watching her face in the warm lamplight. The scars were still there, still noticeable, but they seemed less prominent somehow. Her enthusiasm for the subject matter animated her features, making her green eyes bright and bringing color to her cheeks. For the first time since their marriage, he saw not just the damaged woman society had labeled as his punishment, but the intelligent, passionate person she had always been beneath the surface. When she finished the chapter and closed the book, a comfortable silence settled between them. Not the awkward quiet of strangers sharing space, but the peaceful stillness of two people who had genuinely enjoyed each other's company. "That was fascinating," Marcus said. "I had no idea there were so many useful plants native to the Western territories. There's so much we don't know about the natural world," Eleanor replied, her voice warm with interest. "I sometimes think about what it would be like to explore those territories, to catalog the plants and learn their properties. Of course, that's not possible for someone like me, but it's pleasant to imagine someone like me." The phrase carried layers of meaning. A woman, a scarred woman, a woman without independent means or social standing. All the barriers that society placed between Eleanor and her dreams were contained in those 4 simple words. "Perhaps not exploration," Marcus said thoughtfully, "but you could experiment here, in your garden. Try growing some of these new plants. Learn their properties through direct observation." Her eyes lit up with an excitement he had never seen before. "Do you think, would it be possible to obtain seeds? I know they must be expensive and difficult to find. I have contacts in the shipping trade," he said, warming to the idea. "Captains who travel to California and the Oregon Territory. I could inquire about obtaining seeds or cuttings of interesting plants." For a moment, Eleanor looked as if he had offered her the world itself. The expression of wonder and gratitude on her face made him realize how starved she had been for someone to take her interests seriously, to treat her intellectual curiosity as valuable rather than eccentric. "Would you really do that?" she asked softly. "Of course," he said, and meant it completely. "Your happiness matters to me, Eleanor." It was the first time he had used her given name since their wedding day, and the first time he had acknowledged that her emotional well-being was important to him. The words hung in the warm lamplight between them, marking a shift in their relationship that neither had quite expected. The mysterious helper had emerged not from outside their marriage, but from within it. Marcus was beginning to see that helping Eleanor pursue her interests and dreams might be the key to building something real from their arranged union. And Eleanor, hesitant but hopeful, was beginning to believe that her husband might be someone who could see past her scars to the person she truly was. The lamp continued to burn steadily between them, casting light that seemed to illuminate more than just the pages of books or the stitches of needlework. For the first time since their wedding, both Marcus and Eleanor began to glimpse the possibility that their marriage might become something more than mere legal obligation. It might become a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine care for each other's well-being. The first package of seeds arrived on a bitter January morning, delivered by a weather-beaten ship captain named Thomas Bradley, who had just returned from the California territory. Marcus had met him at the docks before dawn, eager to examine the carefully wrapped packets that represented weeks of correspondence and favors, called in from his father's extensive network of trading partners. "Strange cargo to be so excited about," Captain Bradley remarked, stamping his feet against the cold as they stood in the Sullivan warehouse. "Most folks want gold or silver from California. You're asking for plants and dirt." "They're for my wife," Marcus explained, examining the neat labels written in unfamiliar hand. "She has an interest in botanical specimens." The captain's weathered face creased into a grin. "A lady scientist, eh? My own daughter's got a head for numbers that puts most men to shame. Good to see a husband who encouraged such pursuits instead of trying to squelch them." Marcus felt a flush of pride that surprised him. Yes, Eleanor was intelligent and curious about the natural world. Yes, he was supporting her interests. But when had he begun to think of these facts as sources of personal satisfaction rather than mere obligations? The walk home through Boston's snow-covered streets gave him time to consider his motivation. Over the past month, since the evening they had first shared conversation by the light of her new lamp, he had found himself increasingly invested in Eleanor's happiness. Not from duty or guilt, but from genuine pleasure in seeing her face light up when she discovered something new or interesting. Their evening readings had become a cherished routine. Eleanor would select books from the lending library based on her expanding interests: agriculture, natural history, even technical treatises on subjects like soil composition and plant breeding. She read with the focused attention of someone making up for years of limited access to education, but also with the joy of discovery that made even dry academic texts come alive. Marcus had begun contributing to these sessions, sharing stories from his shipping work that related to her botanical interests. Tales of exotic spices from the Orient, strange fruits discovered in tropical ports, medicinal plants that native peoples used in ways unknown to European science. He found that his practical knowledge of trade routes and cargo manifests could illuminate the broader context of the plant discoveries Eleanor read about with such enthusiasm. But more than shared intellectual interests, they had begun to develop the comfortable rhythms of genuine partnership. Eleanor continued to manage their household with quiet efficiency, but Marcus had started paying attention to the details of her work. He noticed when supplies ran low and began bringing home items from the market without being asked. He observed that she preferred her coffee stronger than the weak brew his mother served in the mansion, and he made sure to purchase the better quality beans that suited her taste. These small acts of consideration seemed to surprise Eleanor initially, as if kindness from a husband was an unexpected gift rather than basic courtesy. But gradually, she began to respond with similar attention to his preferences and needs. His favorite chair gained additional cushions that appeared mysteriously while he was at work. His morning coffee was always perfectly prepared and waiting when he came downstairs. His shirts, mended so skillfully that the repairs were invisible, lasted far longer than they ever had when sent to commercial laundries. The seeds Captain Bradley had delivered represented something more significant than botanical specimens. They were proof that Marcus had listened to Eleanor's dreams and taken action to support them. As he approached their house on Chestnut Street, he felt anticipation building in his chest, not just for her reaction to the seeds themselves, but For the shared project they would represent. Eleanor was in the kitchen when he arrived, kneading dough for the day's bread with the methodical rhythm he had learned to associate with her morning routine. She looked up as he entered, flour dusting. Her right hand and forearm, her hair escaping from its pins in tiny wisps that caught the morning light. "You're home early," she observed, glancing at the package in his hands. "Is everything all right at the warehouse?" "More than all right," Marcus said, setting the package on the kitchen table with ceremonial care. "Captain Bradley returned from California yesterday. This is for you." Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron, leaving small flower prints on the brown fabric. Her eyes moved from his face to the package and back again, as if she couldn't quite process what he was telling her. "The seeds?" she asked quietly. "The ones you inquired about?" 37 different varieties, Marcus confirmed, beginning to unwrap the package. Some vegetables that grow well in California's climate, some flowering plants, and several that Captain Bradley says the native peoples use for medicinal purposes. The wrapping fell away to reveal dozens of small paper packets, each labeled in careful handwriting with both common and scientific names. Eleanor reached for the nearest packet. With reverent fingers, reading the label aloud, Eschscholzia californica, California poppy. "The captain says they produce brilliant orange flowers," Marcus explained. "Very hardy, able to thrive in poor soil conditions." Eleanor picked up another packet, then another, reading each label with growing excitement. Her face, which had maintained its careful composure even during their most pleasant evening conversations, was transformed by unguarded joy. The expression was so beautiful that Marcus found himself staring, memorizing the way happiness changed her entire appearance. "Marcus," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name since their wedding day. "This must have cost a fortune. How did you even find someone willing to collect seeds from such distant places?" "Captain Bradley has a contact in San Francisco, a botanist named Dr. William Chen, who studies native California plants. When I explained what we needed, he was happy to help. He's hoping we'll share our results if any of the plants adapt well to New England conditions." The word "we" had slipped out naturally, but its implications hung in the air between them. Marcus had unconsciously included himself in Eleanor's botanical project, making it a shared endeavor rather than simply something he supported from a distance. Eleanor noticed. "We?" she asked softly. "If you'd like my help," Marcus said, suddenly uncertain. "I realize gardening is your area of expertise, but I thought perhaps I could assist with the record keeping or building frames to protect tender plants during winter. Whatever would be useful." She set down the seed packets and looked at him directly, her green eyes searching his face as if trying to understand something fundamental about his character. "You really want to help me grow these plants?" "I want to learn," he said honestly. "You've taught me so much about botany through our reading that I find myself curious about the practical application, and I want ... He paused, surprised by what he was about to admit. "I want to share something with you that brings you joy." The words settled between them with quiet significance. They were no longer talking about seeds and gardens. They were talking about the possibility of building something together, of finding common ground that went beyond the legal obligations that had brought them together. Eleanor picked up one of the seed packets again, turning it over in her fingers as if it were made of precious metal. "I've never had a partner in anything before," she said quietly. "At the mill, I helped my father with his work, but I was always the assistant, never an equal collaborator." And after the fire ... double quotes, she trailed off, but Marcus understood. After the fire, she had been completely alone, dependent on charity and now on his legal obligation to provide for her. This would be different, Marcus said. Equal partners working toward a common goal. She nodded slowly, a smile beginning to curve her lips. "I'd like that very much." They spent the rest of the morning planning their garden expansion. Eleanor sketched possible layouts on brown paper, calculating how much space each variety of plant would need and which combinations might thrive together. Marcus consulted his shipping schedules, determining when he could arrange for soil amendments and specialized tools to be delivered. Their conversation flowed with the easy collaboration of people whose skills complemented each other perfectly. By afternoon, they had developed an ambitious plan that would transform the small plot behind their house into a serious experimental garden. Some of the California plants would need protection from New England's harsh winters, requiring the construction of cold frames and possibly a small greenhouse. Others might prove hardy enough to establish permanent populations, potentially becoming new additions to the region's agricultural repertoire. "We'll need to document everything carefully," Eleanor said, her practical mind already considering the scientific aspects of their project. Germination rates, growth patterns, flowering times, cold tolerance. Dr. Chung will want detailed records if we hope to maintain correspondence with him. "I'll have a special ledger made," Marcus said. "Something designed specifically for botanical observations rather than shipping manifests." The idea of a custom-designed garden ledger seemed to delight Eleanor almost as much as the seeds themselves, with columns for temperature readings and rainfall measurements. "Whatever you think would be most useful." She reached across the table and briefly touched his hand, the first voluntary physical contact between them since their wedding day. The gesture was simple, almost unconscious, but it sent a shock of warmth through Marcus that had nothing to do with the temperature of her fingers. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for the seeds, but for treating my interest as worthy of serious attention." The gratitude in her voice made Marcus realize how low her expectations had been. She had expected tolerance at best, possibly indifference or outright dismissal of her intellectual pursuits. The fact that he was not only supporting but actively participating in her botanical work seemed to astonish her. "Your mind is remarkable," Marcus said, meaning every word. It would be a waste not to encourage it. Color rose in her cheeks, a blush that extended to both the scarred and unmarked sides of her face, reminding him that beneath the physical damage was a woman capable of the full range of human emotions and responses. Their botanical partnership officially began the next morning. They rose before dawn to examine the garden site in the early light, marking areas that received full sun versus partial shade, noting which sections held moisture and which drained. Quickly, Eleanor's knowledge proved encyclopedic. She could identify soil types by texture and smell, predict drainage patterns from subtle variations in ground level, and estimate growing requirements for plants based on their native habitats. Marcus contributed practical skills. He calculated the materials needed for cold frames, sketched construction plans that would protect tender plants while still allowing access for daily care, and used his business connections to locate specialized gardening tools that weren't readily available in Boston's general stores. Working together revealed aspects of each other's character that their evening conversations had only hinted at. Eleanor was methodical and patient, willing to spend hours observing small details that others might overlook. She approached problems systematically, considering multiple solutions before choosing the most practical approach. But she was also imaginative, able to envision how their small garden might look. When mature plants filled the carefully planned spaces, Marcus discovered that physical work with a clear purpose was far more satisfying than he had expected. His privileged upbringing had insulated him from manual labor, but there was something deeply satisfying about digging beds, building frames, and preparing soil for planting. Working alongside Eleanor, he felt more useful and productive than he ever had shuffling papers in his father's office. More importantly, their shared project created natural opportunities for conversation and collaboration. They could work in comfortable silence when concentration required it, but they could also talk easily about everything from soil chemistry to their hopes for specific plants. The awkwardness that had characterized their early interactions melted away. When they had concrete tasks to focus on, Eleanor's scarred hand, which she normally kept hidden, proved surprisingly functional when engaged in garden work. She could grip tools firmly and perform delicate operations like separating seedlings, though Marcus noticed she favored her right hand for tasks requiring fine motor control. He began adjusting their work patterns to accommodate her limitations without calling attention to them, positioning materials so she could reach them easily with her dominant hand. Taking over tasks that required two-handed coordination, these accommodations happened naturally, growing out of observation and consideration rather than pity or obligation. Eleanor seemed to appreciate his sensitivity, gradually becoming less self-conscious about her limitations when they worked together. She even began asking for help when she needed it, rather than struggling alone with tasks that were difficult for her to manage. As February progressed and their garden preparations intensified, their partnership deepened in ways that surprised them both. They developed efficient working rhythms, anticipating each other's needs and preferences. They discovered shared tastes in everything from morning coffee strength to preferred working hours. Most significantly, they began to genuinely enjoy each other's company. Marcus found himself looking forward to their early morning garden sessions, not just for the satisfaction of productive work, but for the pleasure of Eleanor's company. She was funny in unexpected ways, making dry observations about plant behavior that made him laugh. She was curious about his shipping work, asking intelligent questions that helped him see familiar challenges from new perspectives. Eleanor, in turn, seemed to be discovering that marriage could involve genuine friendship and mutual respect rather than mere duty and endurance. She began sharing stories from her childhood, describing the gardens her mother had maintained and the botanical knowledge passed down through generations of women in her family. She spoke of her dreams for their California plants, imagining how successful specimens might eventually be shared with other gardeners throughout New England. Their evening reading sessions evolved as well. Rather than Eleanor simply reading aloud while Marcus listened, they began to have genuine discussions about the material. Eleanor would pose questions about plant adaptation and climate tolerance. Marcus would connect botanical concepts to economic principles he understood from the shipping trade. They challenged each other's assumptions and built on each other's ideas with the intellectual excitement of two minds working in harmony. One evening in late February, as they planned the final details of their spring planting schedule, Eleanor looked up from the seed packets they had been organizing. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice serious enough to make Marcus set aside his notes. "What is it?" "I'm happy," she said simply. "For the first time since the fire, I'm genuinely happy. Not just content or resigned, but excited about the future. And it's because of this." She gestured at the seeds, the garden plans, the botanical journals they had been accumulating. "Because of you believing that my interests matter." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire burning in their parlor grate. "Eleanor," he said softly, using her name with the same natural ease she had begun using, "you matter. Not just your interests, but you as a person. I hope you know that." She met his eyes directly, and for the first time since their wedding day. She didn't angle her face to hide her scars. "I'm beginning to," she said. "Thank you for helping me remember who I am beyond what happened to me." The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. They were no longer strangers sharing a house out of legal necessity. They had become partners united by common interests and mutual respect. The foundation for something deeper was being laid through shared work and genuine care for each other's well-being. As winter gave way to early spring, their botanical project became the organizing principle around which their entire relationship revolved. But more than that, it had become proof that two people thrown together by circumstances could create something beautiful and meaningful if they approached each other with Openness and generosity. The seeds from California represented more than exotic plants. They represented the possibility of growth, adaptation, and transformation, qualities that Marcus and Eleanor were discovering in themselves and in each other as their marriage slowly evolved from obligation into partnership. First sign of trouble came from an unexpected source. Margaret Sullivan arrived at their Chestnut Street home on a warm May morning, her usually cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious distress. Eleanor was in the garden, transplanting California poppy seedlings that had sprouted with remarkable vigor. When she heard raised voices from the parlor where Marcus had taken his sister for privacy. "You don't understand what people are saying," Margaret's voice carried through the open windows. "Mother's friends are canceling social calls. The Blackwood family is spreading rumors about Eleanor corrupting you with strange ideas. They're saying she's turned you into some kind of gardening obsessive who cares more about plants than proper society." Eleanor's hands stilled on the delicate seedling she was positioning. She had known this day would come, the day when Marcus's devotion to their botanical project would begin to cost him socially and professionally. She had allowed herself to hope that their private happiness might remain just that, private. But in Boston's tight-knit elite circles, nothing remained hidden for long. Marcus's response was sharp with anger. "Let them talk. My marriage and my interests are none of their concern." "But they are," Margaret protested. "Father's business relationships depend on social connections. Judge Blackwood controls shipping contracts worth thousands of dollars. If he decides you're not suitable, it could destroy everything Father has built." Through the window, Eleanor could see Marcus pacing the small parlor, his hands clenched into fists. "So I'm supposed to abandon my wife's happiness to satisfy a bunch of gossips?" "You're supposed to remember your responsibilities," Margaret said more quietly. "To Father, to the family business, to your position in society. Eleanor seems like a lovely person, truly, but this botanical obsession is making both of you appear eccentric. Eccentric people don't get invited to the right parties, don't make the connections that keep businesses thriving." Eleanor carefully set down her gardening tools and moved closer to the house, unable to resist hearing more of a conversation that would determine the future of everything she had come to value. The garden around her displayed the fruits of their shared labor, neat rows of experimental plants from California, thriving alongside traditional New England vegetables, all carefully documented in the leather-bound journal Marcus had commissioned specially for their project. "What exactly are people saying?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Margaret hesitated before answering. "That Eleanor has bewitched you with unnatural interests. That she's making you neglect proper masculine pursuits in favor of gardening and plant collecting. Some are suggesting she's mentally unbalanced, that the fire damaged more than just her appearance." The cruelty of the rumors hit Eleanor like a physical blow. After months of growing confidence in her intelligence and worth, society was reducing her once again to something damaged and dangerous. Worse, they were using her interests, the botanical work that had brought her such joy and fulfillment, as evidence of her unfitness for respectable company. Marcus's response was immediate and fierce. "Those people are fools. Eleanor's mind is sharper than any of theirs. Her botanical knowledge would impress university professors. The fact that they can't recognize intelligence when they see it says more about their limitations than hers." "But Marcus," Margaret pleaded, "you have to consider the practical consequences. Father received a letter from Judge Blackwood yesterday. Subtle threats about reviewing Sullivan Shipping's contracts. If you don't start behaving more conventionally, the family business could be destroyed." Eleanor sank onto the garden bench Marcus had built for her, surrounded by the evidence of their shared dreams. The California poppies were beginning to show their first orange buds. The medicinal herbs recommended by Dr. Chun were establishing strong root systems. Everything was thriving exactly as they had hoped, but none of that would matter if continuing Their work meant destroying Marcus's family. She had been selfish, she realized with crushing clarity. So grateful for his attention and partnership that she had ignored the cost it might exact from him. Marcus was a Sullivan, heir to a shipping fortune, expected to move in the highest circles of Boston society. His reputation affected not just his own future but the livelihoods of everyone connected to the family business. The conversation in the parlor continued, but Eleanor had heard enough. She rose from the bench and walked slowly through their garden, saying goodbye to dreams she should never have allowed herself to embrace. The seedlings they had tended with such care, the careful records they had maintained, the correspondence. With Dr. Chun in California, all of it would have to end. She couldn't ask Marcus to sacrifice his family's legacy for her happiness. When Margaret finally left, promising to tell their parents that Marcus would come to his senses, Eleanor was waiting in the parlor with the botanical journal open on her lap. Marcus entered looking exhausted and angry, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it during the difficult conversation. "Eleanor," he began, but she held up her hand to stop him. "I heard," she said quietly. The windows were open, and voices carry. His face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Margaret had no right to. She was protecting you," Eleanor interrupted, "as she should. And she's right about the consequences." Marcus stared at her, his expression shifting from anger to alarm. "You're not seriously considering." "I'm considering what's best for everyone involved," Eleanor said, closing the journal with finality. "Your family's business supports dozens of employees. Your reputation affects not just you, but your parents and Margaret as well. I can't ask you to destroy all of that for botanical experiments." "They're not just experiments," Marcus said fiercely, moving to sit beside her on the sofa. "They're our work, our partnership, our—" He stopped, as if surprised by what he had been about to say. "Our what?" Eleanor asked softly. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes intense with emotion she had never seen there before. "Our joy," he said finally. "These months working together have been the happiest of my life. Not because of the plants, but because of sharing something meaningful with you." The admission hung between them, changing the nature of their conversation entirely. This was no longer just about botanical work or social pressure. This was about what their partnership had become, and what they both stood to lose if they bowed to external demands. Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes, but she blinked them back determinedly. "Marcus, you have to be practical. Your father built his business from nothing. You can't let it be destroyed because of my selfish desires for intellectual pursuits." "Selfish?" Marcus's voice rose with incredulity. "Eleanor, your mind is extraordinary. Your curiosity and knowledge have taught me things I never would have learned otherwise. The work we've done together represents real scientific value. Dr. Chun considers you a serious colleague, not a dabbling amateur. How is any of that selfish? Because it's costing you everything that matters, is it?" Marcus challenged. "What exactly am I losing? The approval of people who judge intelligence by conformity? Invitations to parties where the conversation never rises above gossip and business deals? The chance to marry some vapid society beauty who would bore me to death within a year?" Eleanor stared at him, startled by the vehemence in his voice. "Those connections are important for business. Business connections based on social climbing and mutual back-scratching aren't worth maintaining," Marcus said firmly. "If Judge Blackwood is petty enough to destroy our shipping contracts because he disapproves of my wife's interests, then he was never a reliable partner to begin with." The way he said "my wife" sent warmth coursing through Eleanor's chest. There was possession in the phrase, but also protection and pride. He wasn't talking about her as a legal obligation anymore. He was talking about her as someone he chose to defend. "But your family will survive," Marcus interrupted. "Father built the business once. If necessary, he can build it again. Or We can find new partners who value competence over social conformity, but Eleanor. He reached for her hands, capturing both of them in his larger ones. I will not give up the best thing that's ever happened to me, because a bunch of small-minded people can't recognize intelligence when they see it. Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, seeing her scarred left hand held as gently as her unmarked right one. I'm not worth destroying your future over. You are my future, Marcus said with quiet intensity. I know this marriage started as a punishment, but it's become the greatest gift of my life. These months working with you, learning from you, building something together, they've shown me what marriage could be when two people truly respect and care for each other. The words struck Eleanor like lightning, illuminating feelings she had been afraid to examine too closely. She looked up at Marcus's face, seeing emotions there that made her heart race with equal parts hope and terror. Marcus, she whispered. I love you, he said simply. Not despite your scars, not in spite of our circumstances, but because of who you are. Your intelligence, your curiosity, your strength, your kindness. I love the way your eyes light up when you discover something new. I love your dedication to our botanical work. I love the way you've transformed our house into a real home. I love you, Eleanor, and I'll be damned if I'll let anyone make me ashamed of that. The declaration shattered the last of Eleanor's defenses. Months of growing affection and respect had been building toward this moment, but she had never dared hope that Marcus might feel anything deeper than fondness for her. His punishment marriage had become his choice, and he was choosing her. I love you too, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I've been afraid to hope for it, afraid to believe that someone like you could care for someone like me. Someone like you? Marcus's voice was fierce with protective anger. Eleanor, you're remarkable. You're intelligent, accomplished, beautiful. Beautiful? Eleanor touched her scarred cheek reflexively. Marcus cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the damaged skin with infinite gentleness. Beautiful, he repeated firmly. These scars tell the story of your survival, your strength. They're part of who you are, and I wouldn't change a single mark if it meant losing any part of your character. Eleanor felt tears overflow at last, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. For the first time since the fire, someone was telling her she was beautiful not despite her scars, but including them. Marcus saw all of her damaged and whole, scarred and healing, and he loved what he saw. Their first real kiss was tender and careful, both of them aware of the momentous nature of what they were acknowledging. When they finally broke apart, Eleanor felt as if the world had shifted around them. The same parlor, the same furniture, the same afternoon light streaming through windows, but everything had changed because they had finally admitted what their partnership had become. So what do we do about the social pressure? Eleanor asked practically, though her voice was still shaky with emotion. Marcus's jaw set with determination. We continue our work. We live our lives according to our own values, not other people's. Narrow expectations. And if that costs us some business relationships, then we'll find better ones. Your family will adapt or they won't, Marcus said firmly. Margaret loves me. She'll come around when she sees how happy you make me. Father built his business on competence and hard work, not just social connections. Mother. He paused, considering. Mother values respectability, but she also values family loyalty. Once she understands that you're not going anywhere, she'll find a way to make it work. Eleanor wanted to believe him, but she also understood the realities of their situation better than he seemed to. Botanical work, perhaps we could be more discreet about it. Absolutely not, Marcus said with surprising firmness. Eleanor, what we're doing has scientific value. Dr. Chun's letters prove that our documentation is contributing to genuine botanical knowledge. Some of our California plants are adapting better than anyone expected, which means they could be valuable additions to New England agriculture. We're not going to hide our achievements because ignorant people can't appreciate their significance. The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at their front door. Marcus went to answer it, returning moments later with his father, Cornelius Sullivan. The older man's face was grim with purpose as he entered their parlor, taking in the botanical journal still open on Eleanor's lap and the seed packets scattered across their writing desk. "Margaret told me about your conversation," he said without preamble. "I've come to discuss the situation with both of you." Eleanor stood automatically, smoothing her skirts and preparing for the confrontation she had been dreading. But Marcus remained seated, his posture relaxed and confident. "There's nothing to discuss, Father," Marcus said calmly. "My marriage and my interests are my own business." Cornelius Sullivan studied his son for a long moment before shifting his attention to Eleanor. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said formally, "I understand you've developed quite an interest in botanical matters." "Yes, sir," Eleanor replied carefully. "And this interest has led to correspondence with scientists in California?" "Dr. William Chen has been very generous in sharing his knowledge," Eleanor confirmed. Cornelius nodded slowly. "Margaret seems to think this correspondence and your experiments are somehow scandalous. Perhaps you could explain to me exactly what scandalous activities you've been pursuing." Eleanor glanced at Marcus, who gave her an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, she began to describe their botanical work in detail, the careful documentation, the scientific methodology, the practical applications they had discovered. As she spoke, Cornelius's expression grew increasingly thoughtful rather than disapproving. When she finished, Marcus's father was quiet for several minutes, clearly considering what he had heard. Finally, he spoke. "Eleanor, what you've described sounds remarkably similar to the agricultural experiments Thomas Jefferson conducted at Monticello. No one ever suggested Jefferson was eccentric or unfit for public life because of his scientific interests." Eleanor blinked in surprise. She had not expected Marcus's father to make that connection. "The difference," Cornelius continued, "is that Jefferson was a man in a position of established power. You are a woman whose social standing depends entirely on conformity to narrow expectations. Then perhaps it's time those expectations changed." Marcus said quietly. His father looked at him with something that might have been pride. "Perhaps it is," he agreed. "Judge Blackwood's threats concern me, but not for the reasons you might expect. Any man who would destroy business relationships over such petty social concerns is not someone I want to depend on for Sullivan Shipping's future." Eleanor felt hope beginning to bloom in her chest. "Sir, my dear," Cornelius said, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it, "I've spent 30 years building this business on the principle that competence and innovation matter more than social position. If I abandon those principles now to appease small-minded bullies, then I've betrayed everything I've worked for." Marcus stood and moved to stand beside Eleanor, his hand finding hers in a gesture of unity and support. "What are you saying, Father?" "I'm saying that Sullivan Shipping will find new partners if necessary. Partners who value substance over superficial respectability. And I'm saying that any son of mine who has found a wife intelligent enough to correspond with university-trained botanists has chosen very well indeed." The confrontation Eleanor had dreaded became, instead, a moment of family solidarity. Marcus's father had not come to demand conformity, but to assess the situation for himself. And what he had found was not scandal, but substance. As Cornelius prepared to leave, he turned back to Eleanor one final time. "My dear, I hope you'll continue your botanical work. Science advances through the contributions of dedicated individuals, regardless of their social position. If Judge Blackwood cannot appreciate that fact, then he is the one who will suffer from his narrow-mindedness." After he left, Marcus and Eleanor stood in their parlor surrounded by the evidence of their shared passion seed packets, botanical journals, pressed plant specimens drying between sheets of paper, The confrontation they had feared had instead become validation of their choices. "I told you everything would work out," Marcus said, pulling Eleanor into his arms. "Did you really believe that?" Eleanor asked, still somewhat stunned by the afternoon's revelations. "I believed in us," Marcus said simply. "In what we've built together and in our right to build it." Eleanor looked around their home there. Real home now, not just a house they shared out of obligation, and felt peace settle over her for the first time since Margaret's disturbing visit. They would face more challenges, she was certain. Society's disapproval wouldn't disappear overnight, but they would face whatever came together, as partners in every sense of the word. The major confrontation had passed, and they had emerged stronger rather than broken. Their love, tested by external pressure, had proven resilient enough to withstand whatever storms lay ahead. The invitation arrived on elegant cream paper, delivered by a uniformed messenger who waited while Eleanor signed for the unexpected correspondence. The return address bore the seal of Harvard University's Department of Natural History, a name that made her hands tremble as she broke the wax seal with unusual care. Professor Edmund Whitmore requests the honor of Mrs. Eleanor Sullivan's presence. At the quarterly meeting of the Boston Natural History Society, she read aloud to Marcus, who had been reviewing shipping contracts at their kitchen table. He wishes to discuss her remarkable documentation of California flora adaptation to New England growing conditions. Marcus set down his papers immediately, crossing to where Eleanor stood holding the invitation as if it might disappear. 6 months had passed since their confrontation with social pressure. 6 months during which their botanical work had continued to flourish, despite or perhaps because of society's disapproval. Their garden had become a marvel of successful plant adaptation, with California poppies blooming in brilliant orange profusion, alongside medicinal herbs that had never before grown in Massachusetts soil. "Harvard University wants to discuss your work," Marcus said, taking the invitation to examine it more closely. "Eleanor, do you understand what this means?" She shook her head, still stunned by the formal recognition. "Professor Whitmore is one of the most respected botanists in America. I've read his papers on native plant classification. Why would someone like that be interested in our small garden experiments?" "Because they're not small," Marcus said firmly. "Dr. Chun's letters have been circulating among botanical circles. He's been sharing your observations and methodologies with colleagues across the country. Your work is being recognized by the scientific community." The transformation that followed was remarkable to witness. Eleanor, who had spent months hiding her scarred face from disapproving society matrons, now found herself corresponding with university professors who valued her mind above all else. The botanical journal that had begun as a simple record-keeping exercise evolved into a scientific document that was being cited in academic papers from California to Massachusetts. Professor Whitmore's invitation led to a formal presentation before the Boston Natural History Society, an organization that had never before invited a woman to address their membership. Eleanor spent weeks preparing, documenting not just their successful plant adaptations, but the methodologies they had developed for testing cold tolerance, soil preferences, and growing season requirements. The night before her presentation, she stood before their bedroom mirror, studying her reflection with an objectivity that would have been impossible a year earlier. The scars remained, would always remain, but they no longer dominated her self-perception. Instead, she saw what Marcus saw when he looked at her: intelligence, determination, accomplishment. "Are you nervous?" Marcus asked, appearing behind her. In the mirror, terrified, she admitted. "These are men who have devoted their entire careers to botanical science. What if my observations seem amateur to them?" Marcus placed his hands on her shoulders, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "Eleanor, your observations have impressed Dr. Chen enough that he's recommending your methodologies to his colleagues at the University of California." Professor Whitmore wouldn't have invited you to speak if he didn't consider your work valuable. You've earned this recognition." The presentation itself exceeded everyone's expectations, including Eleanor's own. Standing before an audience of Boston's most distinguished scientists, she spoke with the authority that came from months of careful observation and documentation. She presented detailed charts showing germination rates, growth patterns, and adaptation success for 37 different California plant species. She discussed soil amendments that had improved growth rates, cold protection strategies that had enabled tender plants to survive New England winters, and cross-pollination experiments that had produced hybrid varieties with enhanced characteristics. Questions that followed revealed the depth of professional interest in her work. Professor Whitmore inquired about her documentation methods. Dr. Samuel Richardson from MIT asked detailed questions about soil chemistry modifications. Even the famously critical Dr. James Thornton from the Massachusetts Agricultural College acknowledged that her hybrid poppy varieties showed remarkable promise for commercial cultivation. But the most significant moment came when Professor Whitmore made an unexpected announcement. The Society would like to propose Mrs. Sullivan for corresponding membership, the first woman to receive such recognition. Her contributions to our understanding of plant adaptation represent exactly the kind of innovative thinking our organization exists to promote. Eleanor felt the room shift around her as the proposal was seconded and voted upon. In a matter of minutes, she had gone from social outcast to recognized scientific contributor. The scarred millworker's daughter was now a corresponding member of one of America's most prestigious scientific organizations. The transformation extended beyond formal recognition. Word of Eleanor's botanical success spread through Boston's intellectual community, creating a new social circle that valued scientific achievement over conventional respectability. Their Chestnut Street home became a gathering place for professors, agricultural researchers, and serious amateur botanists who came to examine their experimental garden and discuss the latest developments in plant science. These gatherings were unlike anything Eleanor had experienced in Boston society. Conversations focused on ideas rather than gossip, on discoveries rather than social positioning. Her scarred appearance, which had made her a subject of cruel speculation in conventional circles, became irrelevant in a community that measured worth by intellectual contribution rather than physical perfection. Marcus watched his wife's transformation with profound satisfaction. The shy, damaged woman he had married was revealing herself to be a natural leader in scientific circles. She organized botanical expeditions to catalog native Massachusetts plants. She established correspondence with researchers across the country, sharing seeds and observations in an informal network that was advancing American botanical knowledge. She even began writing articles for agricultural journals, her clear prose and practical insights earning praise from readers who had no idea of her unconventional path to expertise. The change in their marriage was equally dramatic. What had begun as legal obligation and evolved into partnership had now become a deep love that permeated every aspect of their shared life. They worked together not just in the garden, but in all aspects of Eleanor's expanding scientific activities. Marcus handled correspondence, arranged meetings, and managed the practical details that allowed Eleanor to focus on her research. More importantly, they had learned to truly see each other. Marcus no longer noticed Eleanor's scars except as reminders of her strength and survival. Eleanor had come to understand that Marcus's love was not pity or duty but genuine admiration for her intelligence and character. Their physical relationship, which had begun tentatively months after their wedding, had developed into genuine intimacy based on mutual respect and affection. The recognition of Eleanor's work had also vindicated Marcus's father's decision to support their unconventional path. Sullivan Shipping had indeed lost some contracts due to Judge Blackwood's disapproval, but they had gained new partnerships with merchants who valued innovation over tradition. The company was prospering under a business model that emphasized competence and reliability rather than social connections. Judge Blackwood himself had become increasingly isolated as word of Eleanor's scientific achievements spread. His attempts to portray her botanical interests as evidence of mental instability looked foolish when Harvard professors were seeking her advice on plant cultivation techniques. His social influence began to wane as forward-thinking members of Boston society recognized that he had misjudged the situation entirely. The most satisfying transformation came when Margaret Sullivan, who had initially been embarrassed by her sister-in-law's unconventional interests, began to take pride in Eleanor's accomplishments. She attended one of Eleanor's presentations at the Natural History Society and was amazed to see her brother's wife commanding the attention and respect of some of Boston's most distinguished men. "I had no idea," Margaret confessed to Eleanor afterward. "When I heard about your botanical work, I thought it was just gardening. I didn't understand that you were doing real science." Eleanor smiled at her sister-in-law's honest admission. Most people don't understand the difference. They see a woman working with plants and assume it's decorative rather than scientific. But observation and documentation are the foundation of all scientific knowledge, regardless of the subject matter. Margaret's respect for Eleanor marked a broader shift in how the Sullivan family viewed their unconventional daughter-in-law. Catherine Sullivan, Marcus's mother, began inviting Eleanor to social events specifically to showcase her accomplishments. She took pride in introducing Eleanor as my daughter-in-law, the botanist, rather than simply Marcus's wife. The invitations that began arriving at their Chestnut Street home reflected Eleanor's new status in Boston society. Scientific organizations requested her participation in conferences and exhibitions. Agricultural societies asked her to speak about plant adaptation techniques. Even some of the social organizations that had previously shunned her began extending invitations, hoping to benefit from her growing reputation. Eleanor approached these opportunities with the same methodical care she brought to her botanical work. She accepted invitations that would advance scientific knowledge or agricultural improvement, while politely declining purely social events that offered no substantive purpose. Her time was too valuable to waste on meaningless entertainments when there was real work to be done. The garden behind their house had expanded to occupy nearly every available space. What had once been a small experimental plot now sprawled across multiple raised beds, cold frames, and small greenhouse structures that Marcus had constructed to support Eleanor's research. Visitors came regularly to tour the facility, often expressing amazement that such sophisticated work was being conducted in a residential setting. Chiun's correspondence had evolved into a formal research partnership. He sent seeds and cuttings from newly discovered California species, while Eleanor provided detailed reports on their adaptation to New England conditions. Their collaborative work was yielding results that neither could have achieved alone. A perfect example of how scientific progress could be accelerated through cooperation across geographical boundaries. One autumn afternoon, as Eleanor was showing a group of agricultural college students through their garden, she paused beside the bed where California poppies bloomed alongside traditional New England asters. The contrast was striking: brilliant orange petals next to deep purple ones. Plants from opposite sides of the continent, thriving together in carefully prepared soil. "Adaptation isn't about changing what you are," she told the students, unconsciously touching the scars on her left cheek. "It's about finding the right conditions to let what you are flourish." These California plants didn't become New England plants. They remained true to their nature while learning to thrive in new circumstances. Marcus, who was documenting the students' questions for future reference, looked up at her words. The metaphor was unmistakable and profoundly moving. Eleanor hadn't hidden her scars or pretended to be someone else to gain acceptance. Instead, she had found a community that valued her true nature and allowed her authentic self to flourish. As winter approached, and they began preparing their tender plants for another season of cold protection. Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary changes that had occurred in less than 2 years. She had begun this marriage as a scarred woman whose greatest hope was simple survival. She was ending this chapter of her life as a recognized scientist whose work was contributing to American agricultural knowledge. The transformation had not erased her scars or changed her fundamental circumstances. She was still a woman in a society that limited women's opportunities. She still bore visible reminders of the fire that had destroyed her family. But she had found a way to build a life where those limitations and losses didn't define her possibilities. More importantly, she had found love, not the desperate gratitude she might have felt for any man willing to accept her damaged appearance, but the deep mutual affection that grew from shared interests, common goals, and genuine respect for each other's character. Marcus saw her scars and loved her anyway, but more than that, he saw her mind and loved her because of what he found there. Their evening routine had evolved to include reviewing the day's observations and planning the next day's experiments. They worked side by side at their kitchen table, surrounded by botanical journals, correspondence from fellow researchers, and notebooks filled with Eleanor's careful handwriting. It was the picture of a marriage built on intellectual partnership as much as emotional connection. Dr. Chun wants us to try growing some of the medicinal plants used by California's native tribes, Eleanor said, reading from his latest letter. He thinks our cold protection methods might allow us to cultivate them year-round in Massachusetts. Marcus looked up from the shipping schedules he was reviewing. That could have significant commercial applications. If we could establish reliable cultivation of medicinal plants that currently have to be imported from the West Coast, we'd need to research their traditional uses first, Eleanor said thoughtfully, and find ways to verify their medicinal properties through systematic testing. We couldn't recommend them for medical use without proper documentation. Their conversation continued late into the evening, covering everything from experimental design to potential partnerships with medical researchers. It was exactly the kind of discussion Eleanor had dreamed of having during her lonely years after the fire. Substantive, collaborative, intellectually stimulating. As they finally prepared for bed, Marcus turned to Eleanor with the expression of wonder that still sometimes crossed his face when he contemplated their unlikely journey together. Do you ever think about what our lives might have been like if Judge Blackwood had chosen a different punishment? He asked. Eleanor considered the question seriously. Sometimes, she admitted. But I can't imagine any other path leading to this happiness. We found each other through circumstances neither of us would have chosen, but we built something together that I don't think either of us could have achieved alone. Marcus nodded, understanding completely. Their marriage had begun as his punishment and her salvation, but it had become their mutual triumph. They had taken the worst intentions of vindictive people and transformed them into the foundation for lives neither had dared imagine possible. The recognition Eleanor had received from the scientific community was deeply satisfying, but it was secondary to the recognition she had found in Marcus's love. He had seen past her scars to her essential self, and in doing so, had helped her see herself clearly for the first time since the fire. As they settled into sleep in the bed they now shared without awkwardness or reservation, Eleanor felt profound gratitude for the strange path that had brought them together. Judge Blackwood had intended to punish Marcus with a scarred bride, never imagining that his victim would become his husband's greatest treasure and deepest love. The transformation was complete, but their story was far from over. Tomorrow would bring new experiments, new discoveries, new opportunities to build on the foundation they had created together. Eleanor Sullivan, botanist and beloved wife, fell asleep planning the future with the confidence of someone who had learned that the most beautiful things often grow from the most unpromising soil. 5 years after their wedding, Eleanor Sullivan stood before the newly completed Sullivan Institute for Agricultural Innovation, watching workmen install the bronze plaque that would mark the official opening of the first research facility in New England, dedicated entirely to plant adaptation studies. The building rose 3 stories from carefully landscaped grounds, its red brick facade and tall windows designed to provide optimal light for both laboratory work and the extensive greenhouse facilities that occupied the entire south wing. The Eleanor H. Sullivan Botanical Research Center, Marcus read aloud from the plaque, his voice warm with pride. I still can't believe you agreed to let us put your name on the building. Eleanor smiled, unconsciously touching the familiar scars on her left cheek, a gesture that had evolved from self-consciousness to simple habit over the years. It seems appropriate, she said. After all, this project began with seeds in our back garden. Now it's becoming something that could help farmers across the entire region. The transformation had been gradual but inexorable. What started as Eleanor's personal botanical experiments had grown into a recognized research program that attracted scientists from across the country. The Sullivan Institute represented the culmination of years of careful work, generous funding from Marcus's expanded shipping business, and partnerships with agricultural colleges throughout New England. Dr. William Chun had arrived from California the previous week to serve as the Institute's first visiting researcher, a full-circle moment that brought Eleanor's earliest scientific correspondent to the facility his encouragement had helped inspire. His presence lent additional credibility to an institution that was already drawing attention from agricultural experts as far away as Europe. Your methodology for testing plant adaptation has become the standard protocol at agricultural colleges across the country, Dr. Chun had told Eleanor during his first tour of the facilities. The Sullivan Method, they're calling it now. You've revolutionized how we approach the challenge of introducing beneficial plants to new environments. The Sullivan Method. Eleanor still felt a thrill of amazement whenever she heard that phrase. The careful documentation techniques she had developed out of necessity in their small garden had evolved into scientific protocols that were being taught to graduate students at Harvard, Yale, and Columbia. Her practical innovations, the cold frame designs, soil preparation techniques, and systematic observation schedules, were being replicated in research facilities across 2 continents. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the Institute's opening was the presence of other women in its research programs. Eleanor had insisted from the beginning that gender should not be a barrier to scientific participation, and the Institute's first class of research associates included 12 women alongside 18 men. They came from diverse backgrounds, farmers' daughters with practical plant knowledge, college graduates seeking advanced scientific training, even a few women who, like Eleanor herself, had found their way to botany through unconventional paths. Margaret Sullivan, now married to a progressive Boston lawyer named David Thornfield, had surprised everyone by enrolling in the Institute's first education program. Eleanor showed me that intelligence isn't decoration, she explained to anyone who questioned her decision. It's a tool for building something meaningful. The morning of the official opening ceremony, Eleanor woke before dawn, a habit that had persisted from their early gardening days. She found Marcus already up, standing at their bedroom window overlooking the Institute grounds. Their home had been rebuilt on a larger scale to accommodate Eleanor's expanding work, but they had kept the same small garden where their partnership had first flourished. The California poppies still bloomed there each summer, now accompanied by dozens of other species that had become permanently established parts of the New England landscape. Nervous about today? Marcus asked, turning to embrace her. Excited, Eleanor corrected. This represents everything we've worked toward, a place where scientific research can flourish without the constraints of social prejudice or limited resources. The ceremony itself drew attendees from across the academic and agricultural communities. Professor Whitmore from Harvard delivered the keynote address, describing Eleanor's journey from amateur observer to recognized innovator as an inspiration for anyone seeking to contribute to scientific knowledge. State officials praised the Institute's potential for improving Massachusetts agriculture. Even the mayor of Boston attended, declaring the facility a source of civic pride. But the most meaningful moment came when Judge Harrison Blackwood appeared unexpectedly among the attendees. Now in his 70s, the man who had arranged Marcus and Eleanor's marriage as punishment looked frailer than Eleanor remembered, his hair completely white and his once commanding presence diminished by age and perhaps regret. He approached Eleanor during the reception that followed the ceremony, his steps careful and his expression uncertain. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said formally, "I wanted to congratulate you on this remarkable achievement." Eleanor studied his face, seeing genuine emotion beneath the diplomatic politeness. "Thank you, Judge Blackwood. I appreciate your attendance today. I owe you an apology," he said, quietly, his voice carrying only to Eleanor despite the crowded room around them. "When I arranged your marriage to young Sullivan, I intended it as a humiliation for both of you. I was wrong, profoundly wrong about your character and potential." The admission hung between them, carrying years of accumulated understanding. Eleanor had long since forgiven the man whose vindictive intentions had inadvertently created the foundation for her happiness. But hearing him acknowledge his misjudgment provided a different kind of closure. "Your intentions were indeed unkind," Eleanor said honestly. "But the outcome has been the greatest blessing of my life." Sometimes the worst motivations produce the best results through paths no one could have foreseen. Judge Blackwood nodded. Slowly, "You've become everything I failed to recognize you could be. The failure was mine, not yours." After he walked away, Marcus appeared at Eleanor's side, having observed the conversation from a respectful distance. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Complete," Eleanor said simply. "That apology was something I didn't know I needed until I received it. Not because I required his approval, but because it confirms that the change in how people see me is real and lasting." The Institute's success exceeded even their most optimistic projections. Within its first year, research conducted there led to the successful cultivation of 12 new plant varieties that improved both crop yields and nutritional value. For New England farmers, the facility's seed exchange program connected agricultural researchers across the country, creating a network of information sharing that accelerated innovation throughout American farming. Eleanor's role evolved from hands-on researcher director and visionary, though she maintained an active laboratory schedule and continued her correspondence with botanists worldwide. Her administrative skills, developed through years of managing complex research projects, proved as valuable as her scientific expertise. The Institute thrived under her leadership, attracting funding from private donors, government agencies, and international organizations interested in supporting agricultural innovation. The success brought opportunities that would have been unimaginable during Eleanor's years as a social outcast. She was invited to lecture at universities throughout the country, to consult on agricultural projects in developing regions, even to serve on government committees examining food security and sustainable farming practices. Each invitation represented not just personal recognition, but validation of the principle that scientific contribution mattered more than social background or physical appearance. Marcus's role as her partner and supporter had evolved as well. He had developed genuine expertise in the business aspects of agricultural research, managing the Institute's finances and creating partnerships with commercial enterprises interested in developing promising plant varieties for market distribution. His shipping business had expanded to include specialized transport of botanical specimens, serving researchers throughout North America who needed reliable means of sharing plant materials across long distances. More importantly, their marriage had deepened into the kind of partnership that served as an example for the younger researchers who worked at the Institute. They approached challenges as equals, combining Eleanor's scientific knowledge with Marcus's business acumen, to solve problems neither could have addressed alone. Their relationship demonstrated that marriage could be built on mutual respect, shared goals, and genuine appreciation for each other's unique strengths. The evening of the Institute's second anniversary, Eleanor and Marcus walked through the greenhouse facilities after the research staff had gone home. The building was quiet except for the gentle sound of water circulation systems and the rustle of plants responding to evening temperature changes. Hundreds of species from around the world were thriving under carefully controlled conditions, representing years of patient work and accumulated knowledge. Do you remember when we thought 37 seed packets were an ambitious experiment? Marcus asked, pausing beside a section dedicated to medicinal plants from South America. Eleanor laughed, the sound echoing softly in the humid air. I remember thinking a proper reading lamp was the most generous gift anyone had ever given me. Now we have research facilities that universities envy. They continued their walk, passing experimental plots where hybrid varieties were being tested, seed storage areas that preserve genetic material from hundreds of plant species, and laboratory spaces equipped with the latest scientific instruments. The Institute represented not just their shared vision made real, but proof that individual dedication and partnership could create lasting change. There's something I want to show you, Marcus said, leading Eleanor to a section of the greenhouse. She rarely visited an area designated for Marcus's own botanical experiments. He had developed his own interests in plant breeding over the years, focusing on developing varieties with enhanced cold tolerance that could extend growing seasons for New England. Farmer's Dot in the center of his experimental area grew a single plant unlike anything Eleanor had seen before. It bore flowers that seemed to combine characteristics of California poppies with those of traditional New England wildflowers, the brilliant orange of the western plants blended with the deeper purples and blues of eastern species. How did you create this? Eleanor asked, kneeling to examine the unique blooms more closely. 5 years of careful cross-pollination, Marcus admitted. I wanted to develop something that represented our story, two different plants from different environments, creating something beautiful together that neither could have achieved alone. Eleanor understood immediately. The hybrid flowers represented their marriage, their partnership, their journey from reluctant strangers to devoted collaborators. Like the plants, they had maintained their individual characteristics while creating something new and beautiful through their union. What will you call it? She asked softly. Marcus smiled. Papaver Eleonora. Eleanor's poppy. I've already submitted the documentation to the botanical registry. The gesture was so perfectly thoughtful, so representative of everything Marcus had come to mean to her, that Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude for the life they had built together, despite or perhaps because of the difficult circumstances that had brought them together. As winter settled over the Institute grounds and they prepared for another season of research and discovery, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from the scarred mill worker's daughter to the director of a renowned research facility. The path had been neither straight nor easy, but every challenge had contributed to her growth and understanding. The scars that had once marked her as damaged goods had become simply part of her appearance, no more significant than the color of her hair or the shape of her hands. The real transformation had been internal, the development of confidence in her abilities, pride in her accomplishments, and certainty that her worth was determined by her contributions rather than her appearance. Her relationship with Marcus had evolved far beyond anything either had imagined possible during their awkward wedding ceremony. What had begun as legal obligation had become a love story that inspired young researchers who came to the Institute. They worked together, traveled together, faced challenges together, and celebrated successes together with the seamless coordination of people who had learned to function as a genuine team. The Institute's success had also created opportunities to help other women find their way into scientific fields. Eleanor made a point of seeking out young women who showed botanical aptitude, providing them with educational opportunities and research positions that might otherwise have been denied to them. She particularly enjoyed working with women who had faced their own challenges, poverty, family opposition, physical disabilities, helping them discover that obstacles could become stepping stones with sufficient determination and support. One of her most promising protégées was Sarah Henderson, a young woman from a farming family who had lost her hearing in a childhood illness but possessed an extraordinary visual sensitivity to plant health and development. Under Eleanor's mentorship, Sarah had developed innovative techniques for diagnosing plant diseases through careful observation of subtle changes in leaf color and growth patterns. Her work was already attracting attention from agricultural colleges, seeking better methods for early disease detection. Every person has unique gifts, Eleanor often told the young researchers who worked at the Institute. Society's failure to recognize those gifts doesn't diminish their value. Sometimes it takes finding the right environment and the right supporters to let those gifts flourish. The words reflected her own experience as much as her philosophy of scientific education. She had possessed botanical aptitude long before meeting Marcus, but it had taken his recognition and support to help her develop that aptitude into genuine expertise. The Institute existed partly to ensure that other people with similar gifts would find the support they needed to realize their potential. As spring returned and preparations began for another growing season, Eleanor stood once again in the small garden where her scientific journey had begun. The California poppies were emerging from winter dormancy, their first green shoots pushing through the soil with the persistence that had made them successful colonizers of new environments. Marcus joined her, carrying coffee and the morning correspondence that still brought news of botanical discoveries from colleagues around the world. They had established a morning routine of reviewing the latest research while planning their own day's activities, a practice that combined the intimacy of married life with the intellectual stimulation that kept their partnership vital. Dr. Chen writes that our cold tolerance research is being applied to fruit trees in Northern California, Marcus reported, settling beside Eleanor on the garden bench they had built together years earlier. Apparently, our methods for gradual temperature acclimatization are helping orchardists extend their growing ranges into previously unsuitable areas. Eleanor smiled, warming her hands on her coffee cup as she considered the implications. Their work, begun in a small Boston garden, was now contributing to agricultural success thousands of miles away. The knowledge they had developed through patient observation and experimentation was spreading through networks of researchers and practitioners, creating benefits they had never anticipated. Sometimes I think about that first package of seeds Captain Bradley delivered, she mused. 37 varieties that seemed like such a bold experiment. Now we have over 2,000 species in our collection, and researchers from 6 countries collaborating on adaptation studies. Growth, Marcus observed. Like the plants we study, our work found the right conditions and flourished beyond what anyone could have predicted. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a carriage bringing visitors to the Institute, a delegation of agricultural researchers from England who had come to study American plant adaptation techniques. Eleanor rose to greet them, straightening her dress and checking that her hair was properly arranged. She no longer thought consciously about positioning herself to minimize the visibility of her scars, though the habit persisted in formal situations. As she walked toward the main building to meet their guests, Eleanor caught sight of her reflection in one of the greenhouse windows. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who had been traded for a mule 6 years earlier. This woman stood straight and moved with confidence, her scarred face animated by intelligence and purpose rather than shame and resignation. The scars remained, would always remain, but they had been integrated into a life of such richness and meaning that they seemed almost insignificant. Eleanor Sullivan, botanist, Institute director, beloved wife had become someone who happened to bear scars, rather than someone defined by them. The transformation was complete. But the story continued. Each day brought new experiments, new discoveries, new opportunities to expand the boundaries of agricultural knowledge. Each season brought new students eager to learn, new researchers seeking collaboration, new challenges that required innovative solutions. Most importantly, each day brought the continued joy of partnership with Marcus, a man who had learned to see past surface appearances to recognize the extraordinary person beneath. Their love had grown from shared work and mutual respect into something that sustained them both through challenges and celebrated with them through triumphs. Judge Blackwood had intended to punish Marcus Sullivan by forcing him to marry a scarred bride. Instead, he had unknowingly created the conditions for one of Boston's greatest love stories, a partnership that had transformed not just two individual lives, but had contributed to advancing agricultural science for the benefit of countless others. Eleanor Sullivan, who had once believed herself worthless, had become invaluable. The woman given as punishment had become the greatest treasure and deepest love of a man who had learned that true beauty comes from character, intelligence, and the courage to pursue meaningful work despite society's obstacles. Their story would inspire other unlikely partnerships, other scientific collaborations, other transformations of limitation into opportunity. But for Eleanor and Marcus, the most important fact was simpler. They had found each other, recognized each other's worth, and built something beautiful together that would outlast them both. The new beginning had become their life's work, not just the Institute and its research, but the daily choice to see possibility where others saw limitation, to find hope where others found despair, and to create love where others had intended only punishment. It was, Eleanor reflected as she greeted their visiting researchers, the most satisfying revenge possible, turning cruelty into kindness, limitation into opportunity, and intended punishment into unexpected blessing. The California poppies bloomed. Around them, living proof that with proper care and support, anything could thrive in new soil. 10 years had passed since that first tentative conversation about botanical interests by lamplight. The Institute now occupied 23 acres on the outskirts of Boston, its reputation extending far beyond New England's borders. Eleanor's correspondence filled 3 filing cabinets, connecting her with agricultural researchers on 4 continents. The Sullivan method had become standard curriculum at agricultural colleges from Maine to Georgia, and requests for consultation arrived weekly from government agencies, private companies, and international development organizations. But perhaps the most remarkable development was happening in the Institute's newest building. The most remarkable development was happening in the Institute's newest building, Eleanor Sullivan Academy for Young Botanists. Established 3 years earlier with funding from Marcus's increasingly prosperous shipping enterprise, the Academy provided scientific education to promising students regardless of their social background or financial circumstances. The student body included farmers' children, urban immigrants seeking new opportunities, and young women whose families had initially resisted their scientific interests. Eleanor walked through the Academy's corridors each morning, stopping to observe classes where teenagers bent over microscopes, documenting plant cell structures with the same meticulous care she had brought to her first seed experiments. These young people represented the future of American agriculture, generation that would approach farming challenges with scientific rigor rather than tradition alone. Mrs. Sullivan called out 16-year-old Thomas Chun, Dr. Chun's nephew, who had traveled from California specifically to study at the Academy. "Could you examine my soil sample analysis? I think I've identified mineral deficiencies that might explain the poor wheat yields in the eastern counties." Eleanor reviewed his careful documentation, impressed by the thoroughness of his approach. "Excellent work, Thomas. Have you considered how your findings might guide fertilizer recommendations for next season's planting?" The young man's eyes lit up with excitement. I was hoping to design field experiments testing different soil amendments. Dr. Chun suggested I might collaborate with local farmers willing to try new approaches. Such conversations filled Eleanor's days with satisfaction that went deeper than personal achievement. Every young person who learned to approach agricultural challenges scientifically represented multiplied impact knowledge that would spread through farming communities, improving crop yields and food security for countless families. The academies. Success had also attracted attention from educational reformers who saw it as a model for practical scientific education. Delegations from European agricultural colleges visited regularly, seeking to understand how the institute combined rigorous scientific training with real-world application. Several states had already established similar programs based on the FAM Academy's curriculum and teaching methods. Marcus's role had evolved beyond business management to include educational innovation. He had developed partnerships with agricultural equipment manufacturers, creating opportunities for academy students to learn about the latest farming technologies, while providing companies with feedback from scientifically trained young farmers. His natural talent for seeing connections between different industries had proven invaluable in creating sustainable funding sources for the Institute's expanding programs. Their personal relationship had continued to deepen in ways that surprised them both. After 12 years of marriage, they still looked forward to their morning conversations over coffee, still shared the excitement of new discoveries, still found comfort in each other's presence during challenging times. But they had also developed the easy companionship of people who had weathered difficulties together and emerged stronger. The scars that had once dominated Eleanor's self-perception had become simply part of her history, visible reminders of survival and resilience rather than marks of damage. Young women at the academy often asked about them, usually with the directness of people too focused on learning to worry about social niceties. "My grandmother was burned in a factory fire," one student confided. She always said the scars taught her that healing was possible, even when damage seemed permanent. "Is that how you feel about yours?" Eleanor had considered the question carefully before answering. "The fire changed how I looked, but it didn't change who I was capable of becoming. Sometimes I think the scars helped me understand that worth isn't determined by appearance," a lesson that proved useful when I needed to prove myself in scientific circles. Such conversations reminded Eleanor that her story had become larger than her personal experience. Students, colleagues, and visitors often spoke of her journey from social outcast to respected scientist as inspiration for overcoming their own obstacles. The narrative had taken on a life of its own, encouraging people to pursue their interests despite discouragement from family, financial limitations, or social prejudice. The Institute's annual symposium had become one of the most important agricultural conferences in the country, drawing researchers from around the world to share findings and discuss emerging challenges. This year's theme, Adaptive Agriculture for Changing Climates, reflected growing awareness that farming practices would need to evolve rapidly to address environmental challenges that traditional agriculture wasn't equipped to handle. Eleanor's opening address to the symposium participants touched on themes that had shaped her entire career. Adaptation requires courage, the willingness to try new approaches even when traditional methods feel safer. Plants that survive in new environments aren't necessarily the strongest or most beautiful, but they are the most willing to change. The same principle applies to agricultural practices, scientific methods, and human societies. The speech was interrupted several times by applause, particularly when Eleanor spoke about the importance of including diverse perspectives in scientific research. The symposium audience included more women and people from working-class backgrounds than any previous agricultural conference, reflecting changes the Institute had helped promote throughout the scientific community. Dr. Chen, now in his 70s, but still actively researching, served as the symposium's keynote speaker. His address focused on the global impact of plant adaptation research, citing examples from 6 continents where techniques developed at the Sullivan Institute had improved agricultural outcomes for small farmers and large commercial operations alike. 15 years ago, I corresponded with a young woman in Boston who was conducting backyard experiments with California seeds, he told the audience. Today, the methodologies developed from those experiments are being used to address food security challenges in regions where traditional crops can no longer reliably feed growing populations. Scientific progress often begins with individual curiosity and dedication, but its ultimate value lies in its contribution to human welfare. The symposium's final session featured presentations by Academy graduates who had returned to their home communities as agricultural consultants, bringing scientific approaches to farming challenges that had previously been addressed through trial and error. Their success stories illustrated the Institute's broader mission, not just advancing scientific knowledge, but ensuring that knowledge reached the people who could benefit most from its practical application. As autumn settled over the Institute grounds and the last visitors from the symposium departed, Eleanor and Marcus walked through the experimental orchards where fruit trees from around the world were being tested for cold tolerance and disease resistance. The trees were entering dormancy, their leaves turning brilliant colors before falling, to nourish the soil that would support next spring's growth. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Judge Blackwood had chosen a different punishment, Eleanor mused, echoing a conversation they had shared years earlier, but with a different emotional resonance. Marcus slipped his arm around her waist, a gesture so natural after years of marriage that neither of them thought consciously about it. I've stopped wondering about alternative histories, he said. This life, our work, our partnership, the students we're teaching, feels so perfectly suited to who we are that I can't imagine we would have found it any other way. Eleanor leaned into his warmth, watching the last light of day illuminate the Institute buildings where tomorrow's agricultural scientists were already planning experiments that would shape farming practices for decades to come. Do you think we've accomplished what we set out to do? We've accomplished more than we ever dared dream, Marcus replied. But more importantly, we've created something that will continue growing long after we're gone. The students, the research methods, the networks we've built, they'll keep expanding and adapting, just like the plants we study. The observation carried profound satisfaction. Their work had transcended personal achievement to become something larger and more lasting. The Institute would continue its mission of agricultural innovation under future leadership. The Academy would keep training young scientists who would carry forward their commitment to practical research and inclusive education. The methodologies they had developed would continue evolving as new challenges required innovative solutions. As they made their way back to the house that had been their first shared home and remained their refuge from the demands of public life, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. The frightened young woman who had been traded for a mule had become someone whose opinions were sought by government agencies, whose research methods were taught at universities, whose life story inspired others to pursue seemingly impossible dreams. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was the simplest. She had learned to see herself as Marcus saw her, not as a damaged woman grateful for basic acceptance, but as a brilliant scientist deserving of respect, a beloved wife, worthy of devotion, and a person whose contributions made the world a better place. Their evening routine remained unchanged despite the passage of years and the expansion of their responsibilities. They sat together in their parlor, Eleanor reading correspondence from colleagues while Marcus reviewed financial reports from the shipping business that funded their research. The comfortable silence between them spoke of deep understanding and shared purpose. There's a letter from the Department of Agriculture, Eleanor announced, opening an official envelope with the government seal. They're requesting consultation on a new federal program to improve crop yields in agricultural regions affected by recent droughts. Marcus looked up from his ledgers. Another opportunity to apply our adaptation research on a national scale. It would mean traveling extensively, working with farmers and agricultural agents across multiple states. Eleanor continued reading. The compensation would be significant, but more importantly, the impact could be extraordinary. They discussed the opportunity with the systematic analysis they brought to all major decisions, weighing practical considerations against potential benefits. The consultation work would require months away from the Institute, but it would also provide opportunities to train agricultural agents in adaptation techniques that could improve food security for thousands of farming families. What does your instinct tell you? Marcus asked, knowing that Eleanor's intuitive responses to opportunities were as reliable as her analytical approach. That this is exactly the kind of challenge we established the Institute to address, Eleanor replied without hesitation. Large-scale application of scientific principles to solve real-world problems affecting real people's lives. The decision to accept the consultation contract marked another expansion of their influence and impact. Within months, they were traveling throughout the Midwest, working with farmers who were struggling to adapt traditional crops to changing weather patterns. Eleanor's expertise in plant adaptation proved invaluable in developing strategies that helped farmers maintain productivity despite increased temperature variations and irregular rainfall. Marcus's business skills proved equally important. Creating distribution networks that ensured adapted seed varieties reached farmers who needed them most. His contacts in the shipping industry facilitated rapid transport of plant materials across long distances, while his understanding of agricultural economics helped design programs that were financially sustainable for both farmers and seed producers. Federal consultation work became a model for how scientific institutions could partner with government agencies to address agricultural challenges at a national scale. The success led to additional contracts, international invitations, and opportunities to influence agricultural policy at the highest levels of government. Years later, historians would trace the transformation of American agriculture in the late 19th century to innovations that began in a small garden behind a house on Chestnut Street in Boston. The story of Eleanor and Marcus Sullivan became part of the larger narrative of how scientific curiosity, persistent effort, and genuine partnership could create changes that extended far beyond individual achievement. But for Eleanor and Marcus themselves, the most important measure of their success remained the simplest. They had found each other, recognized each other's worth, and built a life together that honored both their individual talents and their shared values. The punishment that Judge Blackwood had intended as humiliation had become the foundation for a love story that proved the most beautiful transformations often emerge from the most unlikely beginnings. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.